I am a big believer in the fact that work-life balance is all baloney. And the reason I think it's
Okay,
baloney,
quotable quote there.
well, it's baloney not because I want people to work all the time. It's not like that.
Of
I'm
course,
very
yeah.
eclectic and have a lot of time for things I do. It's just that I believe that work is a part of life.
And you've been in banking for almost all your life. So looking back, was it something that it was by accident, or was it something that when your parents tell you, oh, you should try to consider becoming a banker, and you said, yes, of course.
I've called myself an accidental banker. I had no plans to be a banker. My agenda was to become a diplomat. I wanted to, uh, join the foreign service, travel and see the world, and be a diplomat. As things happen, to join the foreign service, you had to take an entrance exam,
Yep.
and you needed to be a minimum age, 21, to take the exam. When I cleared my undergrad, I was only 20, so I had a year to kill.
Right.
And I decided to go get an MBA. So if I didn't qualify, I'd have something to fall back on.
Right.
And in the course of my MBA, I realized that there were other vistas, other things you could do. To cut a long story short, I was given an offer by Citibank. And I thought, you know what, it lets you travel overseas, it pays you well. Why
Of
not try
course.
this instead of, going and being a diplomat? Now, I'll tell you the interesting part of the story. When I made that decision, my father actually flew down to where I was to try and persuade me not to take the decision.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
wow.
They said, "Oh, you don't realize how good it is to be a bureaucrat, an administrative officer. You can make a big impact, etc., etc." And honestly, my response to him wasn't very thoughtful because I told him, Dad, forget everything. I'll get paid more in my first salary than you make at the end of your career. So it's a very
Oh,
different life in the private
but
sector.
you were right.
It's
I
true. I mean,
mean, in the end.
compensation matters. But in reality, I fell in love with the job. I realized within 3 or 4 months that the job was made for me.
Is there a
So,
pivotal moment in that 3 to 4 months mark that tell you this is really the right thing for me?
Well, again, it's ironic. We all got sent to the Philippines for our first trainings. And it was a 6 week program. And they brought in people from all around Asia. So from Japan, Australia, Singapore, etc. There were about 50 people in the class. And I topped that whole class. And after I topped the class, I figured maybe I'm good at this.
And let's talk about challenges. Some people that I know of seems to have this romanticized impression of a CEO where things are nice and dandy, just give instruction from ivory tower. But we all also know there are a lot of challenges when it comes to the job of a CEO, and CEO can come under fire. And no one faces the heat more than a bank, especially when things go south. So for DBS, I guess the most obvious one would be when there's a tech outage, when app is down, people cannot pay for stuff. I'm sure you got teams and SOPs in place to deal with it. But for you personally, what is it like? Could you walk us through a day or a days of those chaotic moments?
There are two or three things which are worth touching on. First is this question of accountability. I've always believed that to be a leader, you've got to have a big belief in what President Truman used to have on his desk: the buck stops here. And so the sense of accountability, I think, is quite important. I tell young kids when people are looking for what does it take to be a leader, I tell them individual accountability is the first thing I look for. So you've got to figure at the end of the day, the buck stops with you. And you're right. So that creates its own sets of pressures and challenges because it doesn't matter what the nature of the problem is. Finally, as the CEO of the company, I'm accountable. I personalize that. And whether the problem was with a third party provider or the
yeah.
problem was with a errant employee or it was just an accident. Finally, as far as the consumer is concerned, the customer is concerned, I'm the CEO of the bank, so I've got to fix it. And so that's the first facet. I do take personal accountability. The second facet is this: people do things differently. My management style is, people have called it the helicopter style. So I can be very big picture, but I also roll up my sleeves and get into the details. I get into the weeds. But the third part of the challenge is how do you give people, this is the hardest, how do you give people the sense of urgency, but at the same time, how do you give them air cover and confidence to not lose hope? It's very easy to start beating up on people.
Of course.
Right? And frankly, that's a lot of companies and environments have that culture. It's a blame culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
The minute you start beating up on people and create blame, then you start getting bad outcomes because it makes people fearful. And it makes people fearful. They won't do what you want them to do in the future, which is use their brains, exercise judgment, and do things. And that's always the challenge, the balance between making sure there is accountability, but at the same time you provide enough air cover to not vitiate and dissipate confidence.
I've heard this so many times. When something happens and then you get scolded for it or whatever, or you get taken to task for it, and then the person says, it's work, it's not personal. But I always feel like it's always personal because work is such an important part of your life.
I would agree with that. We spend 8-10 hours working. Your friends are there, your colleagues are there, your impact is there, your growth is there, income is there. How do you divorce that from life?
Exactly.
And therefore, this notion that something is personal and something is not easy. For me, I've always believed that you've got to be friends. You've got to be able to make sure people feel like they're part of a family. You've got to make sure the emotional environment is one of being together and being one. And if you can achieve that, you get really extraordinary work outcomes.
Okay, so we have this round where we just ask our guests some.
Rapid fire questions.
Yeah, it's kind of like a rapid fire, just whatever comes to your mind. What golden rule do you have about managing your time?
Split the urgent from the important.
Wow, that's hard.
No, it's not hard. All of us have urgent things to do. And the urgent things need attention now. But the urgent things are not always the important things. And so I keep my important things for when I can really apply mind to it. And most of my important work happens over the weekend or on planes. But the urgent stuff happens morning to evening when you got to respond and firefight.
If you had 1 extra hour in a day, what would you spend it on?
Reading. So I think the one thing I love reading, and I'm very eclectic. So I read fiction, non-fiction, etc. But I always am left with the stack of books, magazines, periodicals, all I'm going to get to it someday. I just don't get to it.
Okay, complete this sentence. Behind every good CEO is?
A great spouse or partner.
Absolutely.
And finally, one piece of advice for a young person who is starting out in their career.
Nobody knows the future. I mean, that's obviously a non sequitur, but I think the pace of change is dramatic. And therefore, earlier you could take a view on 10 years. Now you can't even take a view on 2 years. So I think what will be useful to build careers actually is the capacity to connect the dots.
Okay.
And therefore, learning how to think, learning how to probe, learning how to work with people, to empathize, these will be far more important than deep domain knowledge because domains will keep changing.